Greetings. Hello, 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 hello. Happy Sunday. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Hope you are maintaining your highest level of mental, physical, and spiritual health on this day. And we, of course, welcome you to this edition of our All African People's Revolutionary Party sponsored Sunday seminars. And today's topic, revolutionary education for our youth. And as is always the case, before we start, we always give respect to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. We thank them for permitting us to exist in these lands for 528 years. And especially during this week when we are asked to sit here and engage in a heinous so-called holiday which celebrates the murder and theft of indigenous people, we ask you to resist that in whatever way that you possibly can. If you have any family or friends that you are getting together with, which you probably shouldn't get together with a whole lot of people, but if you are doing that, then you should raise this discussion about the fact that this is stolen land. We should do that every opportunity that we get. And so this is, of course, a perfect week to do that because the capitalist system is focused on using its holidays to propagandize us, to normalize its theft and murder of humanity. So let's refuse to allow them to do that. And let's also honor our African ancestors all over the world in 120 countries who battle, struggle for a better life for us. And so we start with, we have a little different format today. We are going to, I'm going to start us off and give a context for how we're talking about education for our youth. And then Shakura will engage the bulk of the topic, dealing with actual techniques for engaging our youth and keeping our youth interested in a revolutionary education. Okay, and so let's go ahead and get started with that. And we'll just start with the usual introductions. Ajamu, All African People's Revolutionary Party, engaged in the party work to build Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa, which is our objective. And then Shakura is studying for her doctorate degree, but I think I've forgotten to mention this. She was also a public school teacher in the public school system here in California for multiple years. So, not only, are we operating based on what experience I've been able to have engaging in the independent schools as an APRP organizer, but she has, actual classroom experience in the public school system. So we're going to be pulling on that and, of course, seasoning it with our revolutionary consciousness and understanding of education. And that's how we're going to be proceeding through this next hour. And so we'll go ahead and, like I said, different formats. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. First, this, what we have in these capitalist societies, it's labeled as an educational system. But of course, we know it's not designed to really educate people. Really, what the so-called education system in this society is designed to do is perpetuate the values of capitalism, which are individualism, elitism, liberalism, all of the elements that make it possible for a capitalist society to function effectively. And so, of course, along with that, building up our allegiance to capitalism, forcing us to believe that capitalism is the only viable economic system on earth, and any suggestion otherwise is absolute insanity. And then white supremacy, which is, the main arm of capitalism, and then its other appendages, patriarchy, homophobia, all of these things are upheld through the so-called education system in this society. And so education, as they call it here, is really nothing but a nothing but a catechism campaign designed to force people to have allegiance to this backward system. That's what it's designed to do. And if you want examples of that, all we have to do is look at this week, right? Or this month overall. You know, you start the month with something called Veterans Day in this society. And this is a day when you're told that you need to honor everyone who served in military service for any of the branches of U.S. military throughout the United States of America. And all through this day, you have people posting pictures of themselves and their loved ones or anybody that was in some kind of uniform for this system. And we're all supposed to act like, you know, this is an opportunity to give thanks to people who have given some sacrifice for some freedom that they're supposed to have fought for. And even just any high school study can verify in seconds how absurd that concept is. You know, look, we get it. You know, people join the U.S. military because economic opportunities are limited in this capitalist society, especially for people who come from impoverished or working poor backgrounds. So we get it. That's why people join. But those of us who believe in truth, we need to just start saying that and stop playing along with this lie that anybody that puts on a U.S. military uniform is fighting for anybody's freedom. That's not what the U.S. military is about. It's strictly about enforcing the economic dominance of capitalism for multinational capitalist corporations. That's the sole purpose of the U.S. military, is to do that all over the world. Anybody who's fought in any of these wars, that's what you were doing. Whether it was World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, Grenada, Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever it is, that's what you're doing, is fighting for U.S. imperialism. There's not one person that's been freer from any efforts by any U.S. military people, and certainly not the African population or the indigenous population or the working poor population in this society. Certainly, you are absolutely insane if you believe that the suffering and oppression that you experience, you need to thank the U.S. military for putting you in this terrible situation. You know, when I was a kid and Africans in Hunters Point in San Francisco were resisting against racist practices by police and other capitalist institutions, it was the U.S. military through the National Guard that was deployed into our neighborhood. I remember it as a child, to repress us. So I didn't fall in with the rain yesterday. There's no way you're ever going to convince me that people that put on these uniforms are somehow representing me. They don't have anything to do with representing me. The people that represent me are the people who fight for African liberation against this capitalist system. So, but that's what they tell us about this Veterans Day. And then here this week, they got another one, Thanksgiving, you know, where they want to try to normalize the fact that this land exists because of theft and murder, and that 50 million Africans are here because of theft and murder. They want everybody to forget that, or to act like it's not really that big of a deal, and just normalize the fact that this empire exists. So, you know, this is the type of so-called education that you receive in this society. And we all have received that, no matter what country you live in, because capitalism is the dominant system on earth. And so all the countries in the world parrot the same model of imperialist education. So, you know, the education of our youth, a real education, since we believe that this society is based on oppressing humanity, then that means that any education that's designed to liberate humanity has to be anti-capitalist. It has to be anti this empire. It has to be anti everything that this society represents. There is no way that you can tell us that you can get a quality education here that's supportive of this system. Because just to advance this system, they have to lie to us and get us to believe the lie that this system is a good system. And by doing that, they have to negate everything that the system actually did and does to exploit us. So truth is a critical ingredient to any type of education that is provided to youth in the society. And we have to educate youth because most of us who are older, we're beyond hope. We've already sold out to the capitalist system. All we care about is paying bills and having houses and cars and things that make us look like we meet the capitalist definition of success, which is the image that you've made it on a material basis. I mean, this is absolutely disgusting and pitiful, but that's where most adults are in this society. So we have to focus on educating our youth, because that's the only way we're going to break this cycle of sellouts that so many of us represent. So many people my age are just absolutely worthless. And they're always talking about the youth being the problem. And I tell them all the time, I don't want to talk about the youth. The youth only know what we've taught them. And you don't teach the youth anything except acquire material possessions. So I don't understand why you're complaining about how the youth are so entitled and self-centered. That's you. That's where they got it from, is you. So you're the blame. Look in the mirror. If you want to understand any problem you see in the youth, you got to look in the mirror and see yourself. That's what I tell people my age, 40s and 50s and above, that you are the problem in society. Stop blaming young people. You are the problem. And we need to have more funerals. And when we get rid of people my age and we start educating the youth, that's when we'll have a real revolutionary consciousness. That's right. We need to have a whole lot more funerals, because a lot of these people are totally committed to the capitalist system and are not going to change. So they need to be wiped out. And I can say that because I'm 58 years old, so I can say that. So we got to have truth when we educate our youth. We have to give our youth the truth. And so, they always say, well, the youth is so wild, they won't listen. But, the only reason why I include these pictures here is that I interact with youth on a regular basis. And I never have any problem getting youth to listen to the message that I'm giving them. And so the question you have to ask is, why is that? Why don't you have a problem and the school system has a problem? Well, because I'm not lying to the kids like the school system is. I'm not looking at the kids as components to be exploited, using them for a school and prison pipeline. I'm not doing that with the youth. I'm spending time with the youth, and they understand that I'm there because I genuinely have a care for them and their future and want them to grow up and be quality human beings. So once people understand that, no matter how old they are, they're going to give you the respect that how you're coming to them deserves. So truth is essential to education. If your education is not based on truth, then there's no education taking place. And we have to, in the process of this truth, we have to teach our youth the difference between right and wrong, that people are more important than money. That's irrefutable, that collective existence is a higher level of existence than individualism. That's irrefutable. And we got to stop playing these bourgeoisie games. Well, your truth is your truth. Now, what kind of nonsense is that? Your truth is your truth. This is why we have the problems we have now. So what's been set in motion in this bourgeois world we live in with this your truth is your truth is that, so if I say 1 + 1 = 75, well, that's your truth. You have a right to believe that. I mean, that's really what's dominantly happening here today. And so this is why, you want to ask questions like, well, how can African people support Trump? Or how can African people support the Democratic or Republican Party? Or how can people celebrate Thanksgiving? Or all of these questions. Well, this is the reason why. Because truth and justice has been completely separated from material reality in the capitalist system. Truth and justice are completely separated from material reality in the capitalist system. So the material reality that people function in this capitalist system is whatever they want to allow themselves to believe. And as long as you have that kind of confusion operating, then that's why all this backward stuff flourishes in that kind of environment. So the way we break that chain is we have to tell our youth the truth. We have to tell them the truth, that this system is not for us. This picture here on the bottom right with the children in the school that we do here in Sacramento, I tell them every time, repeat after me, the police are not your friend. The police are not here to help you. They are not here to protect and serve you. The police are your enemy. I tell these kids you're looking at in these pictures that, because guess what, you all, that is the truth. And I tell them, we have to organize to protect our communities against these murdering thugs. That's what we have to do. And if you gasp and are like, oh my God, how can you tell the youth that? Then you're a part of the problem, because that's exactly what the youth need to hear. And they love hearing that because they're not stupid. They see it in their day-to-day life. Their families have been wrecked by the social service system and the police and all this. They're not confused about any of that. We're the ones that are confused. They understand the contradiction. So when I tell them that, that's how you build trust. That's why I can get them to listen, and you can get them to listen too if you tell them the truth. So it's our responsibility to develop mechanisms that disrupt the misinformation and open the eyes of our youth. And we have to do that through, educational processes, which Shakura will talk about in just a second, but we also have to do that through our life and our existence. Like, what kind of people are we when we come before our youth? What are our values? You can't be, I can't go before these youth and talk to these young African women, for example, and tell them that they're valuable and they're beautiful. And then I'm out here chasing down every woman in sight, trying to sleep with them and throw them away for the next one. People can see through that when you behave that way in your life. You're not fooling anybody but yourself. You have to be the living embodiment of the values that you speak. And you have to live out those values that you speak. And when you do that, when you tell these young people you're beautiful, you're intelligent, and then you're treating them like that, and they see that in your behavior and they don't see all that nonsense coming from you, then that's how we get them to believe that. And the reason why they don't believe it now is because that's not what's happening. People telling them all kind of things and living a totally different life when the light is not on them. And that's why we have these contradictions. So we have to raise this bar. Our youth deserve that. They deserve that. And it's our responsibility to provide that to them. So that's what it takes to do that. And of course, this can't happen just on an individual basis. Yeah, sure. Shakura's here. She was raised with all of this stuff that I'm talking about to the best of our ability, her mother and I, to the best of our ability. And when we got divorced when Shakura was 4 years old, and we continued to co-parent her, and still to this day, we continue to co-parent her. And she can tell, she's here, so she can tell you if I'm lying. We continue to do that. And so, and I talked to her mom. We've been divorced going on 30 years. I talked to her yesterday, talked to her all the time. And we do everything with the three of us. Shakura has never been denied the opportunity to have access to both of her parents at all times. So this is important. This is how you model the behavior, because of course, there's sacrifice with that. But even if you do that better than even we were able to do it, it still cannot just be something done on an individual basis or on an individual family basis. We have to organize this type of educational process collectively for our children everywhere on earth. That's how we raise the bar. That's how we improve our environment. That's how we improve our consciousness. And if we improve our consciousness, that's how we improve our conditions, because power begins at conception, right? So once people understand this is correct human behavior, then they can begin to act out that human behavior, model it. And when we have more people doing that, that's when our quality of life improves. So this is what we're talking about today when we talk about education. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Shakura.
Okay, thank you so much, Daddy. I'm really, really happy to be on these seminars each week. And I really hope that I can just kind of walk you all through what this looks like from an educational standpoint so that we can do what is best for our children, because you wouldn't be on the call if you didn't care about that. So I commend you for that. The first thing I'll say is, if you're feeling overwhelmed at all because of your child's distance learning or anything like that, I just want to reassure you that the village is here for you. We hear you, and we're doing the best that we can from the AAPRP standpoint to support you with that. So don't try not to look at it like you are alone. Try not to look at it like you are by yourself, educating your child, plus probably working a full-time job and managing the house and maybe doing other things if you work as a caregiver or have family members that are sick. That's a lot of responsibilities that are being put on parents. And I'm specifically talking to moms, but maybe dads are in these predicaments as well. So we just want you to know that you're not alone and that we are here for you. So I think the first thing is for us to start off, it's important for us to think about, how do our children learn, right? So I don't know if you've had your child tested, or maybe you've literally watched your child and kind of asked them different questions, but I provide the diagram on the right so that we first have to understand, kind of like if you're starting a garden from scratch, you need to know what the soil richness is. Is it healthy soil? Is it soil that needs some reformation or something like that? So let's be mindful of how our children learn. So as my dad mentioned, I did teach in the Sacramento City Unified School District before I moved out of state to attend graduate studies. And when I taught kindergarten, which was one of the best experiences, by the way, I remember talking to colleagues because, of course, we would have circle time where we would do the calendar and we talk about the days of the week. And that was when we did our ABCs and we practiced our sounds and whatnot. And I always noticed that when we had circle time, there were a few songs that I would play, and some of the African children would get up and dance. The other children who were not African would remain seated, but I never had rules in place for what children could stand up and dance and which children could not. So it was really telling to me that the African children, A, felt comfortable enough in the space I provided to get up and dance, because that meant they were vulnerable and they were okay with it. And B, that they felt compelled to do that. And so I talked to that about that with my colleagues. And my colleagues said that in their classrooms, when the African children got up to dance, they reprimanded them and told them to remain seated. So I think it's important that we think about, how do our children literally take in information, because something about music and dancing might help that child remember that song that much more clear, and help them to remember that if they have to provide an answer to you when you're giving them a form of measurement, because you're trying to assess if they know something. So for example, if the song was talking about the days of the week, maybe they're dancing to it because they really like the sound that they hear, but more importantly, it's probably helping them remember that there are 7 days in a week, and they can probably tell you in order Sunday through Saturday what those days are, because the song is helping them to apply it to their brain so that they can actually remember it. So if you're like me, you have to see things written out, so that means you're visual. I just gave you an example of auditory, if you need to really hear something. Or maybe you're kinesthetic, maybe you like touching things. And I also like this diagram because it kind of helps bridge in those three. So as you can see, maybe you're visual kinesthetic and you have a spatial learning need, or maybe you're visually auditory and you do better when you read or write things. If you're kinesthetic auditory, then that means you're more musical and you need to hear things from a musical standpoint. I also think it's important for us to think about this learning disability culture that we have as Africans and how we need to reformat that. And so what I mean is, I would say the learning disability culture falls in line with what my dad alluded to about patriarchy and white supremacy and white privilege and oppressions of any type. I think it's something about us thinking that there's something wrong with our children if our child does in fact learn differently. But whoever said that that was the reality? And if we're not clear about how the child learns, then how effective are we at teaching the child, especially if we are not catering to their learning needs? So one thing that I was really, really proud of when I was in the classroom, and that I'm still proud of today, because I'm still in the classroom, I'm just teaching college students now, is that I always try to be mindful that everyone learns differently. I think having that sensitivity as an instructor is very important. Because how do I get the message across to them if I'm literally communicating a message to them that they are not receiving because it does not work for them in terms of how they take in information? So again, this learning disability culture, we have to be really critical of that. And we have to release the shame. We have to release the embarrassment. We have to release whatever it is we're holding on to as the people. And we need to understand that there's nothing wrong if the child has a learning disability. And I can honestly tell you that after being in the closet myself of having a learning disability. It's a reality that I still have a hard time accepting, because I didn't want to be different, and I didn't want anybody to think I was different, and I didn't want people to treat me a certain way. I didn't want people to treat me like I didn't have the capabilities. So I struggled for at least 5 years in college with this. I had accommodations to get extended time on my tests. I didn't take advantage of them. And it was a waste of money that my mom invested in me getting tested, because I didn't get the help that I needed because I refused to use it. Now, the fact of the matter is I panic when I take tests. So extra time would help. So after I really started thinking about it, I had to accept the fact that this is just what it is. There's nothing wrong with me. I think I'm a decent human being. I think I treat people with respect. And I also don't freak out as much when I take tests because I now know I have a little extra time than the average person. So if you have the capabilities, because I know that testing your child for a learning disability can be expensive, but if you have the capabilities to do that, I would strongly encourage it. If you detect that there might be something there challenging your child that might cause them to have a different way of learning. So if you don't think that there's anything wrong, then I definitely don't need you to go and get them tested. But if you're just noticing that they're studying extra hard and they're still only scoring like C's and D's on their exams, or maybe they're having a hard time retaining information, even though you know they read that chapter 7 times, or maybe they're just having a hard time speaking up. So you know they don't understand when the teacher is talking to them on the virtual platform, but they don't ask questions. So then they still misrepresent their work because they're not doing it correctly. These are all kind of signs that maybe there might be something else going on. And so at the end of the day, it just benefits the child to understand that you support them, and then it helps them learn more about themselves, because then they can build some self-esteem and understanding, okay, I learn differently, but there's nothing wrong with it. I just need to ask these type of questions so that I can make sure that I comprehend what's being asked of me. That's all. That's all. And so what does that look like? It might look like some students might need to record things and listen to them later. It might look like some students need to record things and watch them later. So I'm talking about audio as well as visual recording, right? And we want to be mindful that if we are able to change that culture of how we think about learning disabilities, then we can really build on something better, because then we are literally investing in the child and allowing them to understand not only is this the way that they understand things, but then they can be better communicators because they can use these skills when they're out doing community defense work, when they're out volunteering in the community, when they're out doing any type of engagement where they're interacting with other people. And they may need to explain to that person, hey, do you mind repeating that once more? I just have a different way of processing things and it takes me a moment, just however that looks for that person. Or maybe they don't say that to that person, but it's okay if they ask, hey, do you mind repeating that once more? Or can you write it down for me so I can see it, because I'm a visual learner. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. That shows a person that you actually know more about yourself than people know about themselves. And then it allows them to be better at communicating you messages because they know that they need to be written down because you're visual, for example, or they know that they need to send you something in an audio file because you do better with auditory learning. However that looks for your child, I would encourage you to look more into that. I have patience on here, but I want us to not only be patient with this process of basically reversing what white supremacy has taught our children, but I want you to also be patient with yourselves, because this can't happen overnight. And so my dad alluded to how this has been my childhood, of me understanding that, yes, this information is being given to me on the right hand, but on the left hand, I also need to be critical and thinking about how much of what has been said is not based on truth. And so then I need to go out and actually find the actual story, the actual thing that happened, and kind of combat that with what has been taught to me, so that I can have a better understanding of how this promotes capitalism, and then be that much more critical of it because I am anti-capitalist, right? So I say patience because I want you to be patient with yourselves as parents, because your jobs are not easy at all. I want you to be patient with your children because your children are doing the best that they can. And I want you to be patient that this process is going to take some time. And so I remember when I first started working with the kindergartners, I only had 2 months left in the school year because they asked me to come in towards the end after the other teacher just retired out of nowhere, literally in the middle of the year, which was so unprofessional. But neither here nor there, I came in and had to build relationships. I had to establish trust. I had to establish classroom management. It was a lot of things that I had to do, and I did not have a lot of time to build those skills in. And what I remember was the first couple of weeks, yes, it was difficult, but I would say by the end of my first month, with only 1 month left, they were in a line, in a straight line, and we would go and do bathroom breaks, and they were quiet in the hallways, and they understood that I was trying to keep them safe. They also understood that I wanted them to learn, and I wanted them to be ready for first grade. So when we think about what patience looks like, that's because I was literally telling myself, you've literally been thrown in this classroom and you can only do the best that you can. And I would argue that's the same for you all out there. You didn't start January 1st, 2020, knowing that you were going to become an educator on top of being the employee for the job you currently get paid for. No one could have told you that. And if you did already know that, then maybe you had an advantage, but I'm pretty sure you didn't, because I didn't. And I have literally had to change how I teach my students now because this pandemic has been so impactful in that way. So be patient with yourself, because I'm pretty sure you're doing the best that you can. And if you know that there are ways that you could step it up, then step it up. But make sure that you understand that everything happens in time. All you can do is try to do better the next day, especially if you make mistakes, which brings me to the mental health bullet. I can't stress enough how important that is for us to be mindful of our children. We have to remember they're under a lot of pressure. We have to remember that, as my dad said, this system is ready to attack them by any means necessary. We have to remember that if they are not reading at the grade level they should be reading at, that there are prisons literally being built right now for them based on their reading scores. We also have to remember that they have been targeting and they are being bullied. We have to remember that their teachers do not care if they succeed or not. I remember, Daddy, I don't know if you remember this, but when I was in 8th grade, we had a parent-teacher conference, and my algebra teacher, I did not do well in math because I have a learning disability and I process numbers differently. And so he was very frustrated with me because he basically had given up on teaching me. And so at the parent-teacher conference, my mom asked him, so what are the steps that we need to take to get her ready for the A through G requirements? So if you're familiar with the California college system, then you understand that all high school students need to have A through G requirements met in order for them to, quote unquote, be ready for college without taking remedial classes when they start as a freshman. And he said to her, college? I think we just need to make sure that she graduates from high school without getting pregnant. Yes, he did say that. Yes, he did. So I'll never forget that. And my mom looked at me and she said, did you hear what he just said? And I nodded my head and she said, so he's telling you that he's not going to help you. So that means it's up to you and I to make sure you pass his class. In front of him, she said that. So I guess my point to you all would be, what kind of strategies are you all not only demonstrating for your children, but maybe interacting with them to build your mental health? Because this is a very stressful time and it's only going to get more stressful. The homework loads are only going to increase. The test scores are only going to be more pragmatic and more stressful. And, you know, God forbid you all have to do standardized tests from a virtual learning platform, but that's probably what's going to end up happening. If you choose to send your child back to school, that still is going to be stressful for you because you're worried every day about their safety of not contracting COVID-19. So I think it's very important that you build in how you practice mental health as you are teaching your students these new skill sets and being mindful of their learning styles, being mindful that they may have some challenges and maybe a learning disability is on their horizon. And so how do you work with that? How do you deal with that? Communicating with their teachers, if you have counselors to your ability that you trust, you know, how does that look for you? And making sure that you all continue to practice other strategies that you can use to protect yourself. So I mentioned, you know, volunteering in the community. I also mentioned building community defenses. What I also want to mention is, if you're not sure what that can look like for you or how to go about steps with that, maybe you could start by reading on some people who have practiced community defenses. And so, you know, we talk about Kwame Nkrumah every week. He's one example. There are many other examples out there. Maybe there are people in your community who have published some things, or maybe you can look to Kwame Nkrumah for other suggestions on how you would go about doing that. But I'm not just saying reading by yourself. I'm saying reading with your child. Maybe you all can have like a reading group where you're reading a chapter a week, which is separate from the education piece. My dad taught me a long time ago that you should never let school interfere with your education. And that has stuck with me because it's very important that we continue to learn outside of this classroom spatial setting, if you understand what I'm saying. So I think that that's important. And along those lines of reading about other people who have practiced community defense mechanisms, along those lines of reading about other people who are volunteering in their communities and showing you what that facilitation and that collaboration looks like, which also builds collectivism, by the way, because you're working with other people. The problem solving piece is also important because that enables you to understand, okay, just like my dad and him talking to the youth, we really don't need the police. So let's figure out how to solve these problems within our own communities. And it could be something as small as the recycles not getting picked up, or maybe it's something larger than that, but maybe giving your child the ability to try to brainstorm some solutions to that. Even if you don't end up moving forward with those solutions, just giving them an opportunity to be critical about something is the whole point of that. Next slide, please. All right, so along those lines, we want to make sure that we are training our children to understand the value of reading and research. More often than not, our children get very bored with reading and they start to dislike it because maybe they struggle with it, maybe they are embarrassed that they struggle with it, or maybe they're not reading something that is actually stimulating them enough to keep them interested. So I think it's really important that we continue to engage them in different ways, continue to give them access to different books. If finances are an issue, try to look for websites where books are offered for free. If not, I can probably put something in the chat, but I have a website where you can download PDFs for free. And of course, most of the books are based on college textbook materials, but they might have some books that might be on a lower grade level for primary students. So it's worth looking into, and I can add that to the chat as I get through my last slide. I also want us to think about how important is it to do research. So I'm not talking about, conducting a study in your neighborhood. What I'm talking about is maybe doing a science experiment one day a week, and maybe once every 2 weeks, because I don't want to, build more and put more on your plate than you already have. But I think it's just really important to just keep them engaged with different things, because that's how you keep them stimulated. And that's also how you allow our African children to understand how the world works. So whether it's a science experiment that deals with insects, or whether they're making ice cream, which is literally a 5-minute science experiment you can do with them with Ziploc bags and rock salt. I've done it before. It is not that complicated. And then it allows them to literally see how the minerals build together to help melt the ice, and the materials literally solidify and become ice cream. And so they can literally see this metamorphosis happening. And it's really cool. It's cool to watch the actual science experiment, but it's really cool to see the child and how they're learning from that as it's happening. I also want us to understand that just like any other skill, analytic skills need to be practiced and they need to be developed just like you would if you were going to the gym and doing push-ups to work on your arms, right? So that's why I said we want to keep practicing that. Think time is a concept that I try to use from time to time, because sometimes you might ask your student a question and they may not know the answer right away. So trying to be patient with them as their brain is moving through and working through whatever they think might be something to help them. So literally honoring this time that they need to develop their analysis on how they're going to answer your question. New concepts may take time to comprehend. So maybe try pairing teaching a new skill with the application, so the child can see the skill used in real life. And so what does that look like? So maybe you read a chapter on how you would build a community development group. And then maybe you actually try to get a couple of people together. Maybe you message them on Nextdoor, and then you actually try to put the actual chapter in real life. So now you've done your analysis where you read about building community defenses, and then you have this piece where you're actually practicing it and showing your child this practice and what that looks like. And then, of course, how does this affect their self-esteem? So it actually reinforces their self-esteem, because along those ways, you're encouraging them. You are encouraging them, you're telling them you believe in them, and they're seeing the development happen, which is enhancing their self-esteem. We're also reminding them that they really do have the power to make things happen, contrary to what the system has tried to tell them they cannot do. One of my favorite quotes is, children don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I really think that that's true. And this is only, 15 years of my experience where I've literally done that. I have literally tried to invest in them that I care. And they have been devoted to me because they appreciate that. And in some cases, they weren't able to get that in their own homes. And so at least they got that when they came to my classroom for 6 hours a day. So I just want to remind us that that's true with anything that we do. They don't know how much we know about science. They don't know how much we know about history, but they do know that we want to foster an environment where they feel safe to ask questions if they're confused about something, but also where we can, try to take their feedback and maybe build on it. So maybe they didn't like the chapter we assigned to them about the Black Panther Party in Chicago. Maybe they wanted to read about the Black Panther Party in Oakland. I don't know, but these are just different examples of letting them contribute to the education so that we can make sure that it's interesting to them while still giving them other pieces of information that they may not want, but they need so that they can build a bigger analysis of how to go about understanding the Black Panther Party altogether, for example, okay? All right, and then just keeping in mind that these children, our children, these African children are coming from teachers who have tried and sometimes successfully broken them. So we just wanna be mindful of that as we continue to educate, encourage, and just enhance their self-esteem. I can't stress that enough. And then we wanna make sure that the materials are representative. So we wanna seek materials that represent your child. That's very important in increasing the availability so the child can relate and feel valued, especially in the era of white supremacy and if your child is African descent. So these pieces about materials being representative is extremely important because it allows them to not only see themselves, it helps them relate to something, and most importantly, it allows them to push back and refute white supremacy so that they can actually see someone that looks like them, and it puts them in a better position to understand how this still affects them, especially because they don't see themselves often. So it's hard for them to place themselves in situations and understand things. And along those lines, we want to expose them to Africa as much as possible. So if you have the capabilities, if you have the means, if you have the resources, and if you feel safe in the era of the pandemic to take them to Africa, that would be most ideal. But I'm talking about picking, materials that are written about the continent of Africa. I'm talking about making sure that our children understand how many countries are in the continent of Africa, understanding that Africa is a continent. These are all things that we want to practice. When I had a family trip a couple of times, so I'm thinking about two experiences, Daddy, when you and I drove to Memphis, and then when my mom and I drove outside of Tennessee to surrounding states. And what we would do is we would play games with one another. And I'm talking about in my 30s, we would play games with my parents. And so some of the games we would play were, can you name 5 African women who were born outside of the US? A lot of times I couldn't. I'm just going to be honest with you. So those are things that I needed to work on. Can you name 10 African people who were born outside of the US? Can you name 5 African men who were born inside the US? Just different things to help them understand that they are African. So why not teach them about themselves? And the importance of this is when you do this, understanding the culture, heritage, language, and roots helps to erase colonialization. This is critical for development because of self-efficacy and protection in adulthood, because they have the ability to protect themselves when they get older because they know thyself. And they know that they are, in fact, African. It's not a secret to them. It's not unbeknownst to them. They are very clear about who they are, which will allow them to be more analytical, actually, because they have confidence in who they are. And they know who they are, and they can tell other people who they are. And then on those same lines, you just want to make sure that you're introducing this material in chunks. So you try to give them a little piece and then give them some application. And then if you feel like they're ready, and we're going to talk about measurements of assessment in just a moment, but if you feel like they're ready, maybe after you assess them and they, to your knowledge, pass that assessment of understanding whatever it is you're testing them on, then maybe you move on to something else. And I already spoke to this, but just embracing their analysis, embracing their questions that they're asking you. I know when you're trying to run errands after they get out of school and you're trying to, do what you need to do, it might be overwhelming to you, but just take in what they're asking you, because that's them being critical. That's them being analytical. So we don't want to shame that. We don't want to discourage that. We want to keep that thinking, that thriving. We want to keep that alive and well, like a heartbeat. We want to keep that pumping. Okay. And then this embracing emotion. So many of us are socialized under patriarchy, especially if we have African men, where they're not supposed to express themselves. They're not supposed to show frustration. They're not supposed to cry. They're not supposed to do any of those things because they're already categorized as angry Black men. And of course, African women are categorized as angry Black women. So I just want to push back against that as much as I can and encourage that we embrace emotion, because emotion is a part of learning. Sometimes you are going to get frustrated. I hated division, for example. It made me very frustrated to learn division, but I understand now its relationship to multiplication, which I loved. So being able to balance those two emotions was really important. And it helped me sharpen my skills as a multiplying student, because then I was stronger with division, right? So I just want us to be critical of that and to think about how we might be unintentionally shaming if they are showing frustration, if they are showing sadness, if they are showing that they want to tear up. We want to embrace that. We want to embrace that because, again, that's what separates us from colonialization, capitalist ways. That's what separates us from white supremacy and this idea of learning without any emotion being given. That's not who we are as a people. We are very affectionate in how we express ourselves. We're very loud. We are very expressive of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. So let's try to encourage our children to do that, because learning can be frustrating. And we, even as adults, we understand that. And so if we help them by embracing these feelings now, these emotions now, then we're channeling them and teaching them how to channel it themselves. So by the time they get older, they can have a better way of how to deal with capitalism and not be as overwhelmed as people who don't know how to manage that. Next slide, please. All right, so last but not least, these are some strategies that you can use if you're actually testing from an applicable standpoint. So retrieval effects. When I was in middle school, I remember it didn't matter which parent picked me up. I would always get in the car and the first thing they would ask me was, how was your day? What did you learn today? And I literally would go through my entire day. So in seventh period, in zero period, we did this, this, and this, and I learned this. In first period, we did this, this, and this, and I learned this. And second, and so on and so forth. And so what's the purpose of that? The purpose of retelling the day with a summary of what was done and what was learned enables the student to reflect, without them forgetting, by the way, of what they did. It helps you understand what they covered. So maybe you can go back and follow up on a lesson, or maybe you can email the teacher later and say, hey, JoJo said that you learned this today. He learned this today. Is there anything I can do to help enhance that skill more? How's he doing with this? Da, 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 da. And then it allows the African child to be in a standpoint where they are in control, which is not often the reality. A lot of times children are the most oppressed individuals in the planet. And so it allows them to kind of structure how they went about learning and what information they took. It also gives you an understanding of what they did understand, or maybe some things that they might want to look at again, because maybe they kind of glossed over it, but maybe went into more detail about other things. So that gives you an idea of what was going on for their day. The bidirectional learning is important because we need to be willing to learn from the child. These children are here for a reason. They're here to teach us something, y'all. So we need to be mindful of that. We can't just have, again, this colonialist, capitalist, white supremacist ideology where we just assume that we are the only ones that have information because we're adults. There's no rule that says that. That was never the agreement when we all came to this planet, okay? So we need to be aware that mutual knowledge and exchange is not only important, but again, it fosters the child to believe in themselves. And we are dealing with a lot of self-esteems that are broken from the system. So we need to be aware of that. And then multiple measures of assessment. You can use different ways to study if the child is retaining information. So maybe you ask them to do a writing sample. Maybe you have a standardized test, so you have them do multiple choice or fill in the blank or true or false. You can also ask them to speak on a topic. So maybe you give them a topic and then ask them to speak on it. Just say a little bit about it. Or maybe you break down what you want them to talk about. And that'll help you listen to them and understand, do they understand the context based off of what they're saying? And then last but not least, you can maybe ask them to read a paragraph and then tell you what that paragraph means. Reading comprehension is also a good way to test someone's ability to let you know if they understood something. And those are all methods of measurement that you can practice with your children. And then I mentioned this before, but the Think Out Loud games. So as I said, can you name 5 African women who were born outside of the US? Can you name 10 African organizations that were established in the United States, but are now have chapters outside of the US? Just getting them to think about other things that may not be so school related, if you understand what I'm saying. Because again, we still want to learn outside of school because we can't let school interfere with our education. But there's no reason why you can't still make learning fun, even though it's learning about their own heritage as African people. All right, and then the teach back method. This is one of my favorite methods because this allows you to give a new lesson to your student, and then you ask the child to regurgitate the lesson back to you. This gives you evidence if you need to review anything or if you can move forward or not based on their response to you that they give you. Because if they can, in fact, comprehend what it is you have taught them, then they have no problem teaching it back to you. If they can't do that and they have challenges, then you know what you need to go back and review, or you know what you need to go back and try again with, okay? So I am wrapping this up, and I just want to end with one of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass. He says, "It is better to build a child than repair a broken man." So as my dad has already said, we really need to take this seriously, you all. And I just want to make sure you all know if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm only seeing the Zoom side, but if there are questions in Facebook, we can address those too. You are not alone, so please stay encouraged yourselves. Please continue to pat yourselves on the back because this work is not easy. But our children need every single one of us. They need all hands on deck to make this be a viable experience for them because we believe in them, but we just need to convey that to them, especially after the system has worked so hard to not give them that message. Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Shakura. That was outstandingly laid out. And I think, what we wanted to accomplish in this hour today, you all, is we wanted to put a message out there that whether if you have children of your own, if you're around children that are not necessarily your biological results of you biologically, but that you're around, if you work with children in terms of organizational work, or if you want to work with children in terms of organizational work, all of those categories, what we wanted to do is provide some thought starters and ideas and frameworks so that we could say, okay, our children need education that goes beyond the parameters of what the capitalist system is providing them. And then here are some techniques to work with our youth to get them to embrace, the process that we're engaged with them in. So we're hopeful that, you can see that and connect with it and do that, especially, during these times when, we have opportunities to interact with youth. A lot of these things that Shakur talked about, you can engage those even in, it doesn't have to be a 4 or 5 hour session. Like you can engage a lot of these things in a simple conversation. You see youth, and that's one of the things that I've been able to experience is that I'll see youth. I might see them every once in a while, but I make sure to have a conversation and try to, engage with the concepts that Shakur talked about with them. And what ends up happening is that not only do the youth remember what we talked about, but they look forward to it because you're giving them time and energy. You're giving them the opportunity to, express themselves. And there aren't a lot of opportunities like that for African children in this world today. So, most of our youth look forward to that. So you don't have to be a biological parent or someone who has children that you're parenting to utilize these things that we've talked about today. In fact, one of the things that happens is that everybody always says we need to educate our youth, but then nobody really, most of the time, people don't really see it as their responsibility. So, if it's not your responsibility, whose responsibility is it? It doesn't matter. Like, I've never seen it like, okay, Shakur is my only responsibility. I don't have any responsibility to anybody else other than her. Like, to me, that's the most primitive form of thinking. Like, for me, not only just every African child, but every child, period, is my responsibility to try to leave them with something that can help them grow and develop in the right direction. When we had we did the free breakfast program in Portland, Oregon in 2015 and 16, we would, a couple of times a week in a cafe, we would serve breakfast in the neighborhood where we were doing our community defense work. And we would have, dozens of children come through, and, it were different children all the time. And there were some times where I remember one particular day, there were about 11 children, and for whatever reason, they were all European that day. And we had decided, like, we were not going to turn away any children. Like, we're trying to educate here, and we're not going to turn away any children because if, the only thing that we require when we talk to the parents is that you have to understand that what we're advancing here are revolutionary Pan-African concepts. And if your child is white and you want your child to learn about that, then come on in. We'll give them some pancakes and eggs and fruit, and they can learn about that and they can participate. And so a lot of the parents, they sent their kids in there. And so there was one particular day where there was there were about 11 children, like I said, and they were all European. It just, that particular day, it just turned out like that. Normally, it was overwhelmingly African children, of course. And so this day, we're sitting there talking to the youth and interacting with them. And there was one young child, and she was really interested, for whatever reason, she was really interested in Assata Shakur. So that day, we usually had lesson plans, but that day, because she was, so interested, because she had heard us say something about it one of the previous times she had come in there. And so we started talking about it again. And so about 30 minutes into it, because they would usually stay about that long, 25 minutes into it, African mother came late with her child, and she saw the European kid, and she's like, "What's going on here?" And I'm like, "Well, we're here all the time. So whatever children come in here, those are the children we have, like, if you want more African kids here today, go tell your friends to bring their children here. Help out the process. It's your process. It doesn't belong to us." So, she was like, "Well, I don't think these children should be here." And so, I took her outside and talked to her and was like, "Look, obviously, your child comes here all the time. Like, this is the African program. I actually had taken her son, myself and some of the other APRP folks, we had taken her son on several field trips. So she knew, her child was getting maximum participation without, anybody having to contribute anything to what we were doing. So she knew that. So I told her, like, one of the things that we're trying to teach people here is that when we talk about revolution and we talk about Pan-Africanism, we talk about this stuff, these are not things to be afraid of. And so no matter what you say about, we didn't have any choice in who showed up here today, but no matter what you say about it, all 11 of these children are going to leave here today. And when their racist parents say something, they're going to say, "No, that's not true." I mean, at least there's the potential they're going to do that. They're going to say, "Oh, that's not true," because we know we encountered. And so, education is universal, right? Like someone asked about the, National Basketball Association, professional basketball this season. They had, Black Lives Matter painted on all the courts for the games, and they wore the jerseys that said, instead of their names, "We can't breathe," and "Enough is enough." And so that was what the NBA looked like this year. They're not going to do it this next season, but that's what it was over the summer. And so, a lot of the teams had European players, white players, who were spokespersons for this messaging that they were doing. And a number of people asked me, like, how come those white people get it and, all these other white people don't get it? And I told a number of people, I'm like, look at the situation, right? Like, the NBA is 80% African players from all over the world, 80% African players from the continent, from Europe, there's even Africans from Australia in the NBA, and obviously from the United Snakes. And so I would tell people, these Europeans, oftentimes they're one of only one or two people on their team. And so they experience, when these Africans get pulled over by police, or when they talk about their families having these, they experience that. So that's how you raise people's consciousness. So these people come to understand, by being in this environment, what our experience is. So yeah, I mean, education is education, but use these concepts, and we're here for any questions or any way we can help with anybody who is working, to engage these issues with the youth. And so we want to tell you, next week, with this Thanks-taking coming up this week, we want to process that. We want to decompress that whole thing. And so, especially since normally I would go to the American Indian movements on Thanksgiving sunrise ceremony, but obviously, they're not going to be bringing 10,000 people together in Alcatraz this year. So, this is our effort to do this next Sunday. So we ask you to join us, invite people to come in, and we're going to talk about what correct solidarity with Indigenous people around land looks like. Because everybody says, "Oh, this is Indigenous land," but 90% of people saying that don't really mean it. and they still see this as their land that they own. They still see, even some of you listening right now, you see it, you see this as your land, and you ain't indigenous to nothing in this hemisphere. So, you know, we want to talk about what is correct solidarity with the indigenous people next Sunday. So we hope you'll join us. We hope you'll tell people, same time, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific time. Here are the sites. You're interested in APRP, come on there. The first site, you can inquire about joining. People have been doing that from these seminars, so that's very appreciated, from all over the world, actually. And then, you know, my blog site, The Truth Challenge, abetterworld.me, Hood Communist site, which a bunch of African revolutionaries write from. So thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your Sunday afternoon. And remember this week, have conversations. There's no such thing as Thanksgiving. This is stolen land. We're on stolen land. When they ask you Thursday to do the prayer, say, yes, my prayer is this is stolen land and the indigenous people must get their land back. Forward ever, backwards never. Have a great rest of your Sunday.